Jack, and this is the Vroom Formula One podcast. This week, we're talking about the race in Miami. Very exciting.
Nope.
First time we've been there.
No fun facts about Miami?
I have no fun facts about Miami. This is a little bit. It's a little bit different for us this week. Unfortunately, two things coincide, or really three different things coincided, and as a result, we're recording this pretty late. One, we usually have this luxury being in the U.S. that the race is super early in the day, and then we have the whole day on Sunday to try to record. But this week, it was actually in the same time zone as Nick and I, so that didn't work. Two, it happened to be Mother's Day here in the U.S., so we had other things to do. And then three, I was a little bit sick yesterday, and so we had to postpone again. So today is Tuesday, the latest that we've ever recorded the Vroom podcast.
Tuesday. Thanks, E. coli.
Yeah, so I have no fun facts other than I saw a lot of those glasses. You know what I'm talking about? The Viper glasses? I think that's what they're called.
Oh, yeah. Did you? I didn't notice those. Even in the crowd?
Yeah, when they pan the crowd. I watch on F1 TV, and whenever they are, whenever there would be a commercial or something that is Sky exclusive, like when they would go to Karun in the videos or whatever, they don't have that footage. So they just play like the footage that they broadcast at the actual race. So it's like a bunch of pans of the crowd. So I saw a lot of
mullets and Vipers.
Yeah. It was great.
It's a corner of the earth I don't quite agree with.
I loved it. It was fun.
I have a fun fact.
Yeah.
This was the hottest and most humid race of the year. Miami. Woo.
I wonder if I'm sure that won't actually be the case as we go to more places, right? But so far,
yeah, it'll still be up there, I think.
Yeah, I think it would be up there, but I have to imagine there are some hot. Are we going to Singapore this year? I don't remember.
Are we?
I shouldn't say it like that. Are they? I'm not going to Singapore this year.
I don't know. I don't know the schedule well enough this year. I just know Monaco's by your birthday, and that's it.
Yeah, it's coming up.
Yeah, very soon.
So,
a couple more weeks, right?
Let's talk about things that we do know a little bit about, which would be the stuff that happened this weekend. Qualifying. Honestly, I didn't really have a whole lot to take away from qualifying, especially in the beginning. Did anything jump out to you in like the Q1 section?
Really, no. Maybe it was something about the time of day. When watching it, I was not as concentrated as, 7:30 a.m. when it's just me and my coffee. But yeah, I was super bored by qualifying in general.
Yeah, I agree. It's this week. I don't know. Yeah, it didn't really do it for me as much either in qualifying. The nice thing, I like the U.S. time where we watch in the morning. You get that cup of coffee and you're caffeinated and you're super focused. But
nobody's distracting you. It's Sunday morning.
Yeah.
It's one of the reasons I love this sport.
Yeah, but then, this week is like 4 p.m. for us, so very different. So, I don't know. I don't know what happened in Q1. Kevin Magnussen didn't make it through.
Really?
Somewhat
I didn't even
noticeable.
Notice.
That's about it. Q2, also not particularly memorable, I don't think, but one notable is that George Russell finished in 12th, so he did not make it to Q3, and Lewis did. And also Daniel Ricciardo qualified in 14th, which is pretty terrible.
I think if you're someone who just watched... Oh, no, that's not even accurate. I was going to say if you're someone who just watched races, you wouldn't be shocked that George didn't make it past Q2. But George apparently really likes to get 5th, so that's not an accurate statement. But
yeah,
I guess what I'm trying to say is you might not be surprised that the Mercedes didn't have pace to get George to Q3. But they looked really fast in practice.
Yes. Yeah, that's true. We should definitely mention that. George Russell was P1 in FP1 and FP2.
Yeah. Which doesn't mean a ton, but when you've got a car that hasn't been racing for first and you do put up those times, it's kind of surprising to see.
Absolutely. And from what I heard, they were very good in FP1 and FP2, and then for FP3, they experimented with lowering the ride height slightly.
Yeah.
And that didn't work. I think that brought back some porpoising. So then they tried to put it back to exactly what it was at for FP1 and FP2, and they didn't have the same level of performance. And it's hard to know why. For one, I think the track gripped up a lot, because this is like a totally brand new track. It's in a parking lot for the football stadium, so they have to just build it for this. And maybe for whatever reason, they were good when the track didn't have much grip, and then as it got more grip, maybe that didn't really help them, but it helped other teams a lot.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. The Mercedes story continues to fascinate me.
Yeah. So you texted me about your Mercedes narrative. Remind me what your Mercedes narrative is.
My narrative is that George is outperforming Lewis this year, and no one wants to come out and say it, except Nico Rosberg.
And Jensen Button said something along the same lines.
Oh, really?
Jensen said that when he was racing Lewis, on tracks that the car was easier to drive, Jensen would always beat Lewis. But on tracks where the car was more difficult to drive, it was more finicky, Lewis would always win. So maybe he didn't say exactly what Nico is saying, but yeah. He was alluding at the fact that George is outperforming Lewis.
Oh, that's confusing. I feel like the opposite is happening. Like, the car was easier to drive for many years, and Lewis did very well, and this year it's hard to drive, and Lewis is not doing as well?
Not broadly. He's talking about like the micro from race to race.
I don't know if I understand that exactly.
I'm sorry. I don't know how to help you.
Well, interesting nonetheless. Maybe our listeners are more with it than I am.
More astute.
Yeah, more astute. So more to come on that Mercedes dynamic, though.
Before we get to... Did you have any other qualifying statements?
Well, just to wrap up with Q3, but...
Yeah, go for it.
So in Q3, Leclerc takes pole and Sainz comes in second. I think that Max had a decent shot at pole, but he messed up the last lap. And presumably the reason why he messed up the last lap is that they had some reliability issues in practice, so Max didn't actually get that many laps at this track, and he didn't quite know where the limit was, and he messed it up. But it is worth noting that he did just make a mistake, and I don't think that's incredibly common for him and for a driver that's in this like championship, this caliber of driver. It's rare that you see them just go out on their pole lap and just straight up make a mistake. They just do something wrong.
Yeah.
And then the other thing that happened was Bottas, who is really good at qualifying traditionally, out-qualified both Mercedes. He qualified in P5, and then Lewis was P6, and George we talked about.
Man, I'm really curious how good Alpha would look if Guan Yu Zhou wasn't in the other Alpha.
Yeah. What about if Oscar Piastri was in the other Alpha?
Dude, actually, he'd probably be crushing it. We already know he's better than Guan Yu Zhou.
Yeah. I think that's another interesting dynamic, another narrative that I like to keep bringing up. Because Zhou Guan Yu did well that very first race. He actually got points in his very first race, but then he's been doing terribly since then.
Yeah, I mean, this race is a DNF for him, so you can't really judge, but yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, he qualified in 17th. Bottas is in 5th. It's really, really hard to be a rookie, though. So you
Yeah.
got to cut him a little bit of slack. It's hard to know if Piastri would have done any better. He might have done a lot worse. I think
Yeah.
your rookie year, it's just so hard in F1.
Right. Yeah, before race chit chat, I wanted to ask you about just the track. What did you think about Miami?
Yeah, it was cool. I think I mean, we'll get to some of the way the race turned out, but I was seeing a lot of pessimistic content about how the race would be.
Yeah,
And
the drivers were pretty pessimistic about it. They thought there wasn't going to be passing.
Yeah, and people were saying that the surface was in terrible shape, and I didn't really get that at all from the race. It didn't seem like any of the accidents were due to the surface being bad, and there seemed like there was some good racing and some good passing. I thought it was pretty cool. I thought that little finicky section that goes sort of under the highway.
I think 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, maybe. Or is it like, I'm thinking of the part with the chicane.
Yeah.
I thought that was more towards the end of the lap, but I don't know we said this last time we should get the turn numbers up, and I never did it. But whatever it was, yeah, maybe it's 6, 7, 8. I thought that was actually pretty cool because there were a few moments, I think the drivers didn't really like it, but there were a few moments where they took like too much curb there, and you could see the cars kind of flying, and it's cool to throw in some like really challenging section like that.
Yeah.
What'd you think?
So yeah, I thought it looked great. I thought the fake marina was disgusting. I thought it was a monstrosity.
I loved it.
You loved it? The painted water.
Yeah, I thought it was great. And people were watching the race from yachts in fake water. Oh, that was great. I loved that.
I hate it. Different podcast, but anyway, I thought the track was pretty good. It was better than I thought it'd be. Just looking at it on paper, I thought it looked kind of boring. I thought maybe the straights looked too short, but it shaped up pretty nicely. And yeah, that maybe we're talking about the same sequence of turns, maybe we're not, but 6, 7, 8 seemed like a real struggle for the drivers in the practices. I know a couple of people spun there and went off. But yeah, as far as qualifying the race went, it shaped up to be pretty solid.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say. I know. There was also, I think there was a lot of pessimism that I was getting about the track, even before they knew about the surface too, because it's like built in a parking lot.
Yeah.
Which traditionally isn't great. Parking lots are usually squares and they're flat, and it makes for uninteresting races. But yeah, I agree with all of that. I thought it was better than expected.
I think my one knock was a driver's complaint. There was a lot of blind turns, which I just can't see how you have free reign to create a new track and you have you create a race that has too many blind turns. I think that's kind of ridiculous. Like, driver safety should be more important.
Yeah, I didn't really think about that. That's true. Yeah, it is sort of exciting. There's like an exciting factor to that, and maybe the exciting part is more that the wall is so close. Like, there was that one. Yeah. They kept referencing the like Champions Wall or whatever in Canada in the Montreal track.
But,
that was cool.
It gets
they get that shot. It's sort of like Monaco-esque. You get that shot where and at the end of Jeddah, same kind of thing, like where Max had his incident last year in qualifying. That's sort of fun. But there's no need for those corners to be totally blind. Yeah, I suppose it is just a parking lot. Yeah, you're right. They could just.
It's so dumb.
Well, anyway, let's start talking about the race. So the starting grid was pretty similar to this qualifying order that I will now run through. On pole, Charles Leclerc, and second, Carlos Sainz, so Ferrari front row lockout for the first time in a while. And then Red Bulls, 3, Max Verstappen, 4, Sergio Perez. Like we talked about, Bottas was in 5th, Hamilton in 6th, Gasly in 7th, Norris in 8th, Yuki Tsunoda in 9th, pretty nice qualifying for him, and Lance Stroll in 10th, also surprisingly nice qualifying for him. Fernando Alonso in 11th, George Russell in 12th, Sebastian Vettel in 13th, not so bad, Daniel Ricciardo in 14th, pretty bad, Mick Schumacher in 15th, Magnussen in 16th, Zhou Guanyu in 17th, Albon in 18th. Latifi in his traditional last place of the people that could actually qualify, and then Ocon was not able to run in qualifying because of a crash in practice. So he starts in last.
Remind me, maybe you know, who started from the pit lane?
Yes, good question. 2 cars started from the pit lane, and it was both Aston Martins, ruining Lance Stroll's good qualifying.
That's what I thought. And I don't know why that happened.
So this is what I heard on the broadcast, and I don't 100% understand it, but hopefully this makes sense. I think there's some sort of rule that your fuel has to be above a certain temperature, and if it's not, you can get a penalty. And for whatever reason, Aston Martin felt like their fuel was not up to that temperature. And so to replace the fuel, by the time they realized it, to replace it was like making modifications to the car. Not like, I don't think it's like a Parc Fermé rule, but they had to do it at a time that meant that they were no longer able to actually have their car go out onto the grid. And so they had to start from the pit lane to avoid the penalty of the fuel, was what I heard.
Damn.
Yeah, it's very specific and interesting. I'm wondering why that's a rule.
Yeah, I had no idea about that. I don't know anything.
Yeah. Should have really read a little bit more about that. I'm sure there's some good information out there about why. I just don't know why it is. It's a good question, though. It's a good
Also,
call.
like, are you going to spend your free time reading about Aston Martin and their fuck-ups?
No.
Nah.
I agree with that. In that vein, let's talk about people who are actually in contention for winning.
Yeah.
Right at the start, so we talked about Ferraris on the front and then Red Bulls right behind. And so off the line, Leclerc gets a good start and so does Max. And I thought Max made a really strong move on Sainz.
Yeah.
Very cool.
It's also worth mentioning that Carlos got a pretty solid start too. But Max's line was just beautiful.
Yeah, he played it very well. And strong was just the word that kept coming to mind. I just thought he placed himself there and he did not move, and he was strong and he took it.
And you've got Carlos, who hasn't had a good rep for finishing races and just wants to get some points. So he's not gonna go eyes wide shut into the corner.
Eyes wide shut. Wow. Yeah. And then that's basically the interesting thing that happened. The only interesting thing that I remember, like in the literal start, but it's pretty cool. It looks cool on the traditional helicopter shot of the start. You can really see that line that Max took that you mentioned.
I think the other notable thing is just that Lewis gets out fairly strongly. Or does he? I'm pretty sure he does, right?
I'm not sure.
George is kind of towards the back. I think he did pretty well.
I mean, Lewis was way in front of George.
In
general. I do know in the beginning, maybe in the first couple laps, we learned very quickly that the hard tires look really bad on George's car. So we should mention George came out on the hards and Lewis comes out on the mediums, so they have different strategies. And that definitely comes into play a little bit later in the race.
Yeah.
I think Lewis, I don't know that... I'm pretty sure that Bottas stayed ahead of him because I think Bottas was in 5th for a long time.
Yes,
but
he definitely did.
Lewis keeps 6th, I believe, and George starts falling back from 12th.
I think actually Lewis goes to 8th but he makes up those spots later in the race.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Yeah. I think it was like Ocon and Gasly got ahead of him, something like that.
Oh, Alonso? Ocon started from the back.
Yeah. Right, sorry. Alonso.
Okay. That I could see that. Yeah, I didn't really actively take note of that because it's sort of pro Lewis content, which doesn't really fit with my narrative. Yeah. But I'm glad that you can bring some balance to the Vroom pod. I only take note of the negative Lewis content. So yeah, one thing I wanted to mention with the tires, I've heard a lot of tire talk this year, and maybe I'm just listening to it more than last year, but these cars seem to be wearing the tires in very different ways. And the Mercedes seems to have a lot of trouble heating up their tires. So it's sort of logical that when you put the hard tires on the Mercedes, that they're going to be really bad to start. But there's a chance that once they get up to temperature that maybe they will be good later on, and obviously they will last longer than the mediums. So even though George is falling back, I still think it's an interesting and potentially fruitful strategy for them.
Yeah, it's something I keep meaning to look into, but I keep forgetting the distribution of the tire types. It's always like going over my head, or I'm just not paying attention when they go over it. Because we've mentioned this in previous episodes, it used to be if it was a C, if the C3 was the hard, I think that's how it goes. The C5 would be the soft. It'd be C3, C4, C5. But this year it could be the C1, the C7, the C9. It could be any spread.
Yeah, I wanted to say that the numbers go in the other direction, like the lower numbers were softer, but I might be wrong.
I wouldn't doubt that's true.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure, though, for this race, because I heard it when they said it on the broadcast, I'm pretty sure they were right in a row for this race.
Really?
Like C2, C3, C4, or something like that. But you're right, because we had a race like that earlier this year where there was like a split. It wasn't a continuous set.
And I'd imagine that's the race where Albon was on the hards for 60 laps.
Oh yeah, it might have been.
Yeah.
Was that last race in Imola?
But yeah, tires are definitely playing a big role this year.
Yeah. And I think the slow to heat up cars are more noticeable because of what we've talked about, where the tire blankets can't be as warm. So it's even more on the car to heat up the tires. And that actually, so on lap 8, one thing I wanted to talk about that is the same topic for different cars is, so at this point, Max is in second on the 8th lap, and Charles Leclerc is in first. And Charles Leclerc has been able to hold on to first for a bit, but already on lap 8, Max's engineer comes on and says that there's a little bit of damage to Leclerc's front left tire. And
that you could actually see.
Yeah.
Which was pretty wild.
And so I've heard, this is what I wanted to call out, I've heard that there's this, so the Ferraris tend to heat up their front tires much faster. And this actually occurred a couple times in the race. So the Ferraris will come out faster on those front tires and they'll be more effective earlier, but then as the race goes on, they'll burn them out much faster. And this is exactly what happened here, because on lap 9, shortly after that comment from his engineer, Max is able to pass Leclerc into turn 1 with the DRS.
I think we see Charles lock up sometime around this point as well.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, he's probably having to push very hard.
Yeah.
Because once Max gets free, we see that the Red Bull is actually quite a bit faster than the Ferrari, and Max really pulls away.
Yeah, which is very wild.
Yeah, it's surprising. And I think in retrospect, the Red Bull was probably the faster car, but we didn't really get a chance to see that because of their reliability issues in practice. And then Max didn't have the practice to put in a true pole lap. So that didn't really come out until the race.
For sure.
But we do see it now. So Max takes over. And then one other thing to just mention real quick. A few laps before that, Guan Yu Zhou has to retire. Which is unfortunate. But I think he was in last anyway, so it's sort of...
Did you catch why? I didn't hear.
No, actually.
Or the announcers just weren't interested in explaining it.
Yeah. I guess some sort of reliability issue. Yeah, I don't really remember. Another thing, differences between Red Bull and Ferrari. The Red Bull seems to be much faster in a straight line. And I thought this was interesting because if I remember correctly, this was like the opposite problem from last year. The Mercedes engine would just propel them in a straight line, and the Red Bull was having to find ways to win races without passing in the straight line. And now they have that advantage.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember last year the Merc had a couple things going for it that made it quicker down the straights. Like it was a little bit longer. I think it was a little bit lower.
Oh, interesting.
But yeah, and I think, if I remember correctly, it also progressed throughout the season because last year it kind of leaned Red Bull more so earlier in the season, and then the Merc got some pace, maybe took over a little bit, and then they were kind of really butting heads those last couple of races. But yeah, the Merc was definitely faster in the straight line, and it definitely frustrated Max.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to pass on a straight than in a corner.
Yeah, and that's why the announcers kept talking about it, because it is. You can't really pass. You have to use your straight line speed to actually get by. And so obviously, if one car is faster in a straight line than the other, it's going to make it a lot easier to pass if you're in that one. So now that we've settled the lead of the race for a while, Max will keep that lead for quite a while so we can focus on some other cars for a bit. George Russell's tires start to pick up, and he's able to start making moves around lap 14 or so. He starts to pass. He passes Daniel Ricciardo for P11, and this is when he starts to get in his range. We'll come back to him a little bit. On lap 19, Checo comes on the radio and says he's totally losing power.
This was wild.
Yeah. And so this has happened to Red Bull a bunch of times already this year, so you think, all right, they're going to retire again. But then they at first they deny it, and they tell him that he's crazy and that he's not losing power, but he's going way slower.
No. He's like, I'm losing 3 seconds on the straight. What are you talking about?
And then they tell him to fail 5-0, and that seems to resolve it.
Yeah.
And I was really curious what that meant.
Is this the first time we've seen something like this happen that you know of?
What do you mean like this? Like what?
So, to compare, 10 years ago, if there was an issue with the car, you pulled over to the side of the road and you DNF'd.
Oh.
But now, if there's an issue with the car, some engineer clicks some code and presses enter and the car can run. That shit's crazy.
Yeah, it's wild how
crazy.
how technical things have gotten in that sense.
Yeah.
So I think I was really curious about this, and I was listening to when they were talking to Christian Horner on the broadcast, and he mentions it later on in the race, what actually happened. And so he said that it was a sensor issue. And so when you fail the sensor, it's like switching it off or switching it to another sensor. And so what I was sort of deriving from that is that there's all these computers making these decisions, and so if it's making a decision based on a faulty sensor, it's going to make the wrong decision. And so that's how he fixed it.
They turned off the sensor.
Yeah, or switched it to a different sensor, or like a backup, it's hard to know exactly, obviously, but yeah. So that's pretty interesting, and it also sort of makes a little bit more sense why he could just fix the problem in the car while he's driving, if that was what the problem was.
Right.
But I didn't quite get this originally, but the announcers kept commenting on it, and then Christian Horner said something later in the race that seemed to corroborate this, but apparently he permanently loses a little bit of horsepower from this whole incident for the rest of the race.
I think he said it was like 27 or 29, something like that.
Yeah. Brundle keeps saying British horsepower. And I always thought BHP stood for brake horsepower.
I think it's both. Is it not?
I don't know the British things.
Yeah.
I'm sure that he knows what horsepower stands for because he is a professional or was a professional racing driver. But I just thought that was interesting.
We'll look that up and get back to you guys next week.
Yeah, we need someone,
Jamie.
A producer. Yeah.
Pull that up, Jamie.
So Checo's able to stay in the race, and he stays in fourth, but he is a little slower. So now it's going to be a lot harder. Since their advantage was that straight line speed, he's going to have a harder time passing.
And it was unfortunate because I think he was closing on Sainz at this point. Sainz had a little bit of a gap, maybe 3 or 4 seconds. And Checo had closed it to about 2. And then all of a sudden he's 8 or 9 seconds behind Carlos just because of this mechanical error, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. More reliability issues for Red Bull, but not as bad as before.
Yeah.
So by lap 23, George Russell has worked his way all the way up to P7. And he's been helped because some people have pitted and he's on the hards and he doesn't have to pit yet. But he's at the point where he's catching up to Lewis in P6, who's on the mediums. Mm-hmm. And on lap 23, Lewis comes in for the hards. So now, this is now where the important parts of their strategies start to converge. So George is going to stay out for longer on those hards. If there happens to be a safety car or something and he gets a cheap pit stop, he'll have a big advantage.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that.
He was looking good, too. It wasn't just that other people had pitted and he had the more durable tire. His pace was pretty solid at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, he's been putting in a good race, definitely. Mm-hmm. Then the leaders come in. Everyone else that was sort of in contention was on the mediums, so they all come in for the hards, and positions do not really change. There's some pretty big gaps, and so they're able to stay in the same positions, no undercuts, no overcuts. Yeah,
and Red Bull has the luxury of Ferrari really needing the tires, so Ferrari pits first, Max comes in after, so they don't have to... It's a less stressful situation. They don't have to gamble with what tire type they're going to choose when they already know what the guy chasing them has chosen.
Yeah, exactly. They can just react. Mm-hmm. So on lap 30, more Lewis Hamilton narrative. He starts complaining about his tires overheating after only 5 laps. These are the hards.
Lewis complaining? No, wrong guy. Complaining about tires? No, not Lewis.
Yeah, you're right. So this is interesting because, I thought the Mercedes was having a hard time warming up their tires. It's pretty interesting that he was complaining that they were overheating, and you can see that he locks up and goes deep right around this time. So this clearly is a real problem. And his engineer, interestingly, says that this also happened to George Russell in that once he burned through a bit of the tire, it got better on those hards.
Mm-hmm. Which they didn't mention as it was happening, but you could kind of see it in George's performance. He was kind of stuck behind people, and then he went from being stuck behind people to passing them. So that checks out.
Yeah, one thing to mention... I don't know if we've explicitly mentioned this, but the tires are new this year. Mm-hmm. So all of the new cars are also running on new tires. And so there's probably the same rules apply where they're not allowed to test the tires all that much, just like they're not allowed to physically test the cars all that much. Mm-hmm. So the teams are probably still learning how these tires behave. And
their data sets compared to the previous years are much smaller.
Yeah. And like we've seen... It's interesting. It's not always straightforward. Like the tire, you might actually have to wear the tire down a little bit to get to the point where there is good performance. So they're all trying to figure that out.
That's crazy.
Yeah, at least it's some interesting strategy.
Yeah.
So now, let's see. So on lap 34, which is about 9 laps after the Ferrari comes in for the hards, Max is 8 seconds ahead, and Leclerc comes out and sets a new fastest lap of the race that's 0.4 seconds faster than Max's previous fastest lap. And again, it's just this tire narrative. I think the Ferraris were able to warm up those front tires faster. And so in this point of the race, he's able to come out and set a way faster lap time than Max. But I just thought that was interesting that Max was that far ahead, and then Leclerc can just come out of nowhere with this 0.4 second faster. That's a lot different. That's a lot faster. And then as we'll see, he's not able to make a big difference. But it just feels, this whole tire dynamic and such feels interesting to me compared to last year. I don't remember last year there being such a wild swing where like Max or Lewis would have been in the lead, and then the tire, like the degradation curves or whatever, would be so dramatic that the second place driver would be that much faster briefly, and then it would fall off so quickly.
Just all of the sudden.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. I think that could lead to some really fun races. Because like there could be instance, and actually it happens pretty soon in this race where Leclerc is like with him for a bit, and then Max is able to pull away. Mm-hmm. So the inflection point here happens on lap 41. Lando Norris and Pierre Gasly come together, and this causes a virtual safety car.
This is just the weirdest coming together that I remember seeing, maybe ever.
Why?
Because of the blind turns. Actually. Yeah, go through the play-by-play. Maybe I'll have something to add.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a ton of notes on the play-by-play. I think that Gasly like loses steering in his car.
His tires are cooked on top of maybe a mechanical error, because he's just going so wide.
Yeah, he slows way down. And I think he comes over the radio and says he can't steer.
You know what? I think he had just made contact with Alonso, if I remember correctly. And I think that screwed up his car a bit.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So let's say Gasly's in like 8th at this point, somewhere around there, maybe 9th. His tires are fading. I think that's part of the reason why he makes contact with Alonso. There's some damage to his car. And then all of a sudden he's going really wide and really slow.
Yeah. I think it's also worth mentioning Max lost steering in practice. That was the reliability issue. And you can see like he had to cut all the turns when he was coming into the pits because he literally couldn't steer the car.
Yep.
And these are both, it's like AlphaTauri's the Red Bull sister team. So sort of interesting that that's like a failure mode for them.
So this is happening through those blind turns that I mentioned. And then all of a sudden Lando Norris is on top of him.
Yeah. And Gasly just doesn't see him or something.
Yeah.
And so Gasly crashes into the back of Norris, and that pops his tire off. Mm-hmm. So this causes a virtual safety car, and in the moment, I was really surprised because it seems very obvious to me that that's going to need to be a full safety car because like, Norris doesn't have a tire. They're going to have to get the crane and take his car, and they need a full safety car for that. Little refresher, the virtual safety car is a digital virtual device where they limit the drivers to, I think, like 40% of their lap pace. And so it keeps the gaps more or less between the cars, but they all go slower. But then a safety car goes way slower, and so all the cars line up behind the safety car, and it removes all the gaps that people have built up between themselves. Mm-hmm. And so the nice thing about removing the gaps with the real safety car is that all the cars are on the same part of the track, and so it gives the marshals a lot more time to get out on the track and get rid of debris and move cars. Whereas the virtual safety car, they could be spread out all over the track. They're just moving slower. But even 40% of F1 speed is still really fast. Yeah. And they need to have the cars a little bit away. The marshals can't really be out there when the cars are moving that fast.
And normally a virtual safety car, it's kind of a severity of the damage or the accident or whatever what determines the virtual or the actual or location of where the incident occurred. this was right in the middle of the track. They were maybe slightly off to the side. But yeah, I agree. It really seemed like a pretty obvious full safety car from the moment it happened.
Yeah, it's strange. So George comes in during the virtual safety car, and part of me was wondering, like, should he wait another lap? Because it's got to be a full safety car, and then is he going to get even more time off of his pit stop if he pits during a full safety car? But I don't know. I think what he did was probably fine. So he comes in during the VSC, and since everyone's going slower, it makes the pit stop much faster in relation to the rest of the pack. And so George started on the hards, and he comes in for those mediums, and this is great for him. This is exactly what he wanted for his strategy. Gets that cheap pit stop. Yeah. And now he comes out right behind Lewis Hamilton, but on much newer tires. And Lewis is on the hards, and he's on the mediums.
So I think there's two things here. Earlier, when Lewis did his first pit, or I guess it was his only pit, I forget, whatever. When Lewis pitted around lap 30, they went to the radio, and you could hear George saying, let's not pit. Let's hope for a safety car or whatever. Knowing that it was a gamble, but also maybe likely, and that it would give him a much greater outcome. You know, risk was worth the reward in this scenario, even if it didn't work out. So that winds up being the right call.
Yeah.
And also, kind of back to your point that Mercedes is racing for George. Mercedes goes on the radio again and actually gives Lewis the option. They say, do you want to come in for tires or not? In which case they double stack. George would pit, Lewis would pit, or vice versa. Weirdly giving Lewis the option, which they would tell Lewis what to do, and Lewis would say, no. Now actually giving him the option, and he's like, I don't know. You guys tell me what to do. And then it winds up benefiting George, not Lewis.
Yeah, you're right. When he said that, I was thinking that he just wants them to make the decision so he's able to complain about it after the fact.
I think it's a subconscious game that he plays. He might not even know that he's playing it, but yes.
But he does in towards the end of the race so George ends up getting by him, which makes sense. And towards the end of the race, Lewis comes on the radio and he's complaining he complains about the strategy, and he's saying the strategy really messed him up. Yeah. And they gave him a choice, and he deferred to them, which is making a decision, and that decision potentially didn't work out for him. Although I don't know if him pitting there would have changed things too much. It'd be interesting to see.
That was my next point. It maybe would have changed one thing, which is where he finishes in relation to George. That's it.
Yeah.
So him complaining about strategy, it's fairly inconsequential for Mercedes. It's only consequential for those two guys.
Yeah.
Or it could have been.
Maybe that's why they gave him the choice. Because they were like, this probably doesn't matter for the team. Let's just let him.
We'll let him fuck himself.
So yeah, the other part of my narrative I wanted to throw in here, some of the commentary that I heard after the race, because George beats Lewis again, he does eventually get by him, and we'll talk. There's some interesting details about how he actually does get by him, but the point that I want to make is a lot of especially the British commentators were saying that, this was just, you shouldn't read too much into this. This was just lucky. There was a safety car, and that's why George finished in front of him. And I would like to push back on that a little bit, in that, just like you said, George, this was part of their strategy. They're taking a gamble, and I don't think that if you take a calculated gamble like this and it works for you, that it's totally fair to just say, that was just lucky, you shouldn't read into it. Because this was the strategy, and I think that's a good bet to make, that there was going to be a safety car at this race.
Yeah.
They're doing all these simulations, and I'm sure they have a lot of data, and there's a lot of walls here, like we talked about. It's a street track. I think that's a pretty safe bet to make. And George comes from P12 to beat Lewis, who started in P6 in the same car.
Yeah.
I
With
mean,
the
that's
essentially quicker strategy. He started on the mediums.
yeah, you're right. Lewis was doing the conventional strategy that all the leaders did. Yeah. So I think, I think the commentators have been saying this after basically every race when Lewis is beat by George, that like, oh, don't read too much into it. It's just lucky for this reason and that reason and whatever. But it's getting to the point where it's every race now, and it's starting to be, I think it's starting to be harder to make that argument that this is just lucky.
It's a lot of luck.
Yeah, over and over and over again. You could also say that it was pretty lucky that Lewis was in the best car in the grid for the past 10 years.
Yeah.
And like, he's a very good driver. He crushed his teammate for most of those years, except one Nico Rosberg year. But
Many moons ago.
yeah. But anyway, like I say every week, be curious to see how this plays out in next race in Spain.
And then the next 20 races after that. We're still so early.
Yeah, isn't it great?
Yeah.
The one other thing in this safety car, Checo comes in for a nice fresh pair of mediums, and he's able to do this for free because of the safety car, and he gets right back up into P4 where he was. So now there's like a bit of an interesting battle because Checo has newer, softer tires, but he's also down on power from what we talked about earlier. And right in front of him is Sainz in P3. And on the restart, on lap 47, Checo does get a lot of traction, more traction than Sainz out of the first turn or two. And it's looking pretty close, but Sainz is able to hold him off.
Yeah.
We also see George in P7 all over Lewis in P8, which, as we talked about,
It's what we expected based on the tires.
Yep. And also, Bottas was in front of both of them, but then he makes a pretty bad mistake going deep, and he lets both Mercedes by because they're very close.
Which is so unfortunate. He had them behind him for most of the race. Just couldn't hang on.
Yeah. Otherwise, a really good week for him. Really just that one mistake.
Did you follow the socials at all last week?
Not really.
Valtteri just seems like he loves America. He just seemed so happy. I don't think I've seen that guy smile so much in the last 8 years.
What's not to like? When
Again,
I was
another
in
pod.
what?
That's for our other pod.
When I was in Copenhagen a few years ago, the locals were talking about Finns and comparing them to the American South. And so Bottas is Finnish, and he was in the South, so maybe that's true.
That's so funny because environmentally they're completely different, but I could see the like personality comparison. That's pretty funny.
Yeah, I really I've never been to Finland, and I really haven't been to the American South much, so I can't really comment. But I thought that was interesting at the time. So after a few laps, just like we've been talking about with the tires, Leclerc stays super close to Max, and they have some pretty good battles. So like lap 50-ish. Also lap 50, George. Now they're in P6 because P6 and P5 because they got by Bottas. George gets by Lewis. But so I thought, looking at the coverage, I thought Lewis sort of pushed George off. Like, I thought they were kind of side by side, and Lewis just takes the racing line and pushes George off the track. But we never saw another replay of it, and the commentators seem to think that George... So what happens is, however it happens, George ends up off the track and then finishes the move off the track. I think Lewis seemed to push him off, but however he got there, he ends up off and he finishes the move off. The broadcasters seem to think that George was at fault, but George ends up passed. And then a few laps later, George actually gives the position back to Lewis. And so I don't know. They never showed another replay of it. Did you did you have any thoughts from the one angle there?
I can't believe I forgot about this. Maybe because I just thought it was all so ridiculous. That's why I forgot about it. I was like, this is garbage. Mercedes racing each other for no reason. Yeah, I think it was more like a sociological interaction than it was racing. Because we all knew George's car was just so much faster at that point. Lewis's tires were worn. George was up his ass because he was so much faster. But Lewis still fights as he's going around. And I think that's kind of why George winds up taking the position off the track. Because he probably thought Lewis would concede a little bit because it was very obvious that he's faster. And at the end of the race, you don't want to crash both of your cars if you're Toto Wolff. But that's not what happens. Lewis races George as he has a right to. He does, but I don't think it's what George expected. I do agree. I think what you're saying is accurate. I think Lewis did kind of force him a little bit. But yeah, it was just like, come on.
Yeah.
You're in scoring position. You both are. I get it. You want to win the race, but your tires are obviously shot, dude, and you still got like 10 laps left, maybe more at this point. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as if to drive that point home, I think on lap 54, George lets Lewis by. And this is another thing, the new thing, one of the new things this year that came out of the whole controversy of the race director last year is the race director's not going to make offers to the teams anymore to say like, hey, you did something wrong. If you just give the position back, I won't give you a penalty. There's no more offers. The teams just have to decide to give the position back on their own accord and maybe avoid getting a penalty if they do. And so George gives the position back to Lewis, presumably, under his
under
own
team orders, or
yeah. But like, I kind of wish we saw this a little bit, but they talked about it. I don't know if we really saw this happen. I like when they do this personally, but he timed it just so he lets Lewis by and then immediately gets DRS and just immediately passes him right back, as if to say like, okay, that doesn't even matter that I have to give that back because I'm this much faster than you. I'm just going to take it back anyway.
I think it's also worth noting, I can't remember what it was on the track, but wherever he first passed Lewis was not somewhere passing was happening on this track, which goes to show how much faster he was.
Yeah, he likes to do
through
that.
A corner. Yeah,
I think he did that last race in Imola. I think, right? He made a pass on like a really strange part of the track. I think that was George. Mm-hmm. It's cool. I feel like that's a little sign of a really good driver to just pass in obscure areas.
Yeah, I agree.
I like that though. And then really the last thing during the race that I think is worth noting is there's like a little incident between Vettel and Mick Schumacher, and they come together and Mick comes over the radio and he just sounds so sad. It sounds like he's crying. Yeah, because they're like good friends outside of
both
track.
Of them actually. I think they played a clip of Vettel, and even Vettel's voice was not his typical intonation. You could tell they were both not happy.
Yeah.
I think it's Crofty goes, you can't have any friends in F1. It's like,
yeah. I mean, we've seen that, Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton used to be really good friends. And
yeah. They also kept mentioning that this is like a paternal relationship, which I think is a weird thing to say. You can't just assume that he's acting fatherly towards Mick. There's weird stuff going on there. I don't know. I'm not all for it.
Yeah.
But they definitely have a good relationship. Maybe mentor mentee. You don't have to say it's his dad.
Yeah, that's a better way to say it. I agree.
Yeah.
But that's that. No more position changes. Leclerc gives Max a good run, but like we've mentioned with the tires, once the Red Bull gets into their optimal range, Max pulls away and wins by almost 4 seconds.
Yeah.
Leclerc comes in second. Sainz comes in third. Sainz is able to hold off Checo, presumably because of that slight loss in power. I think if Checo was at full power, he probably would have gotten by Sainz. Max has a very solid race despite making some mistakes in qualifying and having some reliability issues in practice. George, like we've mentioned a lot, comes in fifth. So he continues to be the only driver that's been in the top 5 for every single race, and he beats Lewis Hamilton again. Other notables, Esteban Ocon finishes in P8 after starting from the back of the grid due to not even being able to participate in qualifying. Which, as an aside, it's funny that it's called qualifying because he didn't actually qualify at all, but he still gets to race.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Also, Albon ends up in P9, and he started in P18. So really good race from him.
Another one. That's 2 back-to-back great races from Alex.
Yeah. He's just, I think he's a really quick driver. He's talked about how in the Red Bull stint that he got replaced by Checo, that he just wasn't mentally ready to be at that team. But it's great that they still believed in him and they got him the seat and he's really performing. I mean, just like we saw with George Russell in the Williams, put a really good driver in not the best car and they'll still perform. And that's what we're seeing. So just to run through the rest of the order real fast, Bottas ends up in P7. We said Ocon in 8th, Albon in 9th. Lance Stroll gets some points in P10, which is great for him. Pretty surprising. Alonso finishes in 11th. I think he had some penalties in there. I think he actually finished the race a little bit higher up. Yuki Tsunoda in 12th, Daniel Ricciardo in 13th, pretty disappointing. Latifi in 14th, and then Schumacher in 15th. So Latifi would have been in his usual spot in last, but Schumacher had this coming together with Vettel.
So late in the race.
Yeah, so I guess he still finished, but he was pretty compromised at that point. And then we have a bunch of non-finishers. Kevin Magnussen, Vettel ends up not finishing due to that crash with Schumacher. Gasly had to retire in... because he came together with Lando Norris.
Lando.
I almost forgot. Which also Lando Norris retired, and we said Guan Yu Zhou also retired. So that's that. What'd you think of the race?
I thought it was pretty good. It was a little flat for the middle, maybe 20 to 40-ish. Until we got to the safety car, basically, it was pretty flat.
Yeah.
Then we got the drama between the Mercedes, which was fun. And I think that late race effort we saw from Charles was probably just like, okay, we're at the end, let's dump the battery. And then Max had enough battery to defend the whole way. But late racing was pretty strong from those two. Unfortunately, didn't see any passes, but yeah, I think that's just because Max really had the faster car for this track. It was pretty good. Definitely not the best race, not the worst race.
Yeah, I not the best, but I thought it was really entertaining though. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah,
qualifying maybe not as entertaining, but the race, the last 20 laps, 25 laps of the race were pretty great. What else? A couple random things. I don't know if we're doing this race for I keep saying we. F1 and now us as a part of the F1 ecosystem are doing this race for the next 10 years. So they're going to keep building this thing in the parking lot of the football stadium for 10 years.
You think you have it in you, man? 10 more of these?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know
if I'm still friends with you in 10 years, doing something wrong.
Uh, I also loved, I think this is the first week, it's at least the first week that I've noticed it, probably the first week that they're doing it. Did you notice on the Williams, the air intake at the top is painted to look like a Duracell battery?
Yeah. The gimmicky things this weekend, there's too many of them. That's the least of the offenses.
I love all of
it. A Duracell battery? The use and throw away battery? It's 2022, guys. Come on. We don't have Game Boys anymore.
I also loved Willie T. Ribbs doing the interviews post-race. Did you see that?
So I watched this race way past my bedtime on Sunday night, and after I finished the actual race, I just immediately knocked out, so I didn't see all this post-race stuff. You gotta give the rundown.
So
who's Willie T. Ribbs?
So he's an American racing driver. He was the first. Oh. Yeah, he was the first. I think he was the first African American person to test a Formula One car in the 80s. And I think he also raced NASCAR and a bunch of American series. And so I thought it was cool that they just had someone different doing those post-race interviews. It's usually like some British guy or sometimes Mark Webber.
Yeah.
But he's a real character, you can tell. He called Charles Leclerc Chuck, which I loved.
Yeah, that's hilarious.
Yeah, he got right in close,
Chucky.
and they're worth watching. It was really fun. So they had him on this, and they also had Danica Patrick doing him for qualifying, which I thought was cool.
Okay, yeah, I did hear the announcers mention Danica.
So I don't know, he was awesome. I love that. There's also, I don't know if you watched the podium, but they all came out in Pirelli football helmets. And all the British announcers called them NFL helmets, which I thought was funny. Because football is something else there. There was also this really funny moment where Max had to take this like electric Jeep Wrangler thing from the paddock to the cool down room, which was near where the podium was. And something happened where they didn't know where to go exactly. But they ended up getting this police escort with 2 police motorcycles with their sirens and lights on, even though they're in the stadium. And then they end up driving through the halls of the football stadium. And there's cameras watching them the whole time. And then at one point they go past the whole Red Bull team. So like Christian Horner is with his wife, Jerry, I think her name is, and like helmets there. And they're like passing them in this Jeep. And I just thought it was hilarious. It was so cool.
I hate it. I hate it all. And did you just forget who Christian Horner's wife is?
Jerry, the Spice Girl?
Yeah, okay.
I'm not that familiar with the Spice Girls. That's her name, right? I'm not that familiar with her name.
Ginger Spice.
Ginger Spice, yeah. But her real name is Jerry, right?
I think so.
Hope that's
not as
right.
important. Ginger Spice is way more important.
Okay. I never really knew that much about the Spice Girls.
Yeah, forgiven.
Yeah, those are all my my little fun things I wanted to mention. I also actually though I did enjoy watching Dan Marino shake Max Verstappen's hand and then vigorously wipe his hand off on his pants right after.
Oh, okay. Yes, I actually did have a little closing note as well. They were dripping. I saw Max get out of his car, and there was like 10 different spots of his body that were dripping sweat. It was nasty.
Yeah, they were exhausted. I think it was really hot, like you said, and just nice a hard physical race.
But still, Lewis decided to wear all leather.
That was before the race, though. It was not as hot.
Yeah. Yeah. Ugh.
Yeah, when Max was sitting in that electric Jeep waiting to get driven behind the police escort. The camera was on him, and he was like drinking from his water bottle, and he just looked totally exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
And Willie T. Ribs kept commenting on it too, how tired they were. But yeah, it's cool. They're real athletes. You know, it's hard to keep yourself in that car for a whole race. So, I think we've reached the end of the race. We're in Spain in 2 weeks in Barcelona. Any closing thoughts? What did you learn from this week?
I learned 2 weeks feels like a really long time.
I know.
You quit your job.
That part I don't know about, but it does feel like a long time.
It felt like forever since the last race, and we're about to do it all over again.
You're right. But then we have 2 in a row, because I think the week after Barcelona, they're in Monaco. So
yeah, happy birthday.
Yeah, thanks. In a little bit.
What did you learn this week?
I learned a lot about how the various cars wear down tires. And I tried to talk about it a lot on this podcast, so I hope that you got that too.
Good job.
All right. Well, we'll see you in 2 weeks for Barcelona.
Peace.